Simon Harrison. I'm from the University of Bordeaux 3, and I'll be discussing gestures of negation in English. Now, to tie this presentation in with Wendy's introduction to language and social interaction and gesture studies, I will come back to the 1980s, where Wendy left off, and describe where we are going with modern gesture studies. So, back in 1980, Adam Kendon wrote a landmark paper entitled Gesticulation and Speech, in which he argued that gesticulation and speech are two aspects of the process of utterance, which means that speakers can create utterances and do create utterances out of vocal material and gestural material, and they deploy those together to construct multimodal utterances. Okay, now, 10 years later, and after much research in the lab, David McNeill published Hand and Mind, What Gestures Reveal About Thought, and in this book he argued that gestures are an integral part of language as much as our words, phrases, and sentences. So his main claim was that gesture and language are one system. Since this book, gesture studies has taken off, and gesture centres have mushroomed all over the world, and researchers have been approaching the system, gesture, speech, and language, from various perspectives with various questions. So, some researchers have sought to see gesture as a window onto thought, this sort of imagistic side to language, whereas speech would be the more conventional and linear side to language. Others have focused on gesture as an action, gestures for gestures. So what kind of forms do gestures take? How do speakers organise them in space and in relation to each other? How do we sequence gestures one after the other? Okay, and it's in this latter perspective that I situate my study. So what I wanted to do was see how speakers use gesture when they engage in particular grammatical or linguistic processes. So I selected negation and wanted to see what gestures do speakers perform when they negate. How do they organise these gestures in relation to the negation in speech? Okay, so first of all, I'll provide a brief overview of what negation is. Okay, so negation is a linguistic universal, which means that all languages in the world have a set of forms in their grammar that allow their speakers to negate. Okay, now these forms are, like other forms in language, symbolic structures. So that means that they pair a phonological form with a semantics. And in the case of negation, we have negative particles, such as no, not, and nothing, as well as affixes, such as unpopular, disbelief, improbable, and speakers use these symbolic structures of negation to create a set of negative speech acts, such as denials, rejections, oppositions, and refusals. So speakers use symbolic structures of negation to deny something, to reject something, to oppose something, and to refuse something. Now, it is standard practice in linguistics to identify a set of basic negative constructs. So if we take a look at this example utterance, I don't have to pay for that night, we can identify, first of all, a node of negation. Now this is a specific point in the utterance where the speaker places a negation. So here we have the cliticized not affixed to the auxiliary do. Okay? We can also identify the scope of negation. Now this is the stretch of language that is under the influence of the negative node, and the scope usually runs from the negative particle to the end of the utterance. However, we can also identify foci of negation, and this is when a speaker wishes to indicate that only certain elements in the scope of negation are to be negated. Okay? So it's indicating a point of contrast in scope, and usually they use a nuclear stress to signal this focus. So a speaker might say, I don't have to pay for that night, which means that the speaker has to do something for that night, just not pay. A speaker might say, I don't have to pay for that night, and placing the nuclear stress on that. This will mean that the speaker has to pay for one night, but not the one in question. So focus helps signal points of contrast in scope. Now, typological descriptions of grammatical negation are undeniably useful, but they seem to ignore a very important dimension of negation, that is, of course, a bodily dimension of negation. And when you see this image of a speaker performing gestures of the head and gestures of the forearm, we recognize that there is some kind of negation being expressed. Okay? What I'd like to do is show you a negative speech act, but do so with a video clip so you can see the gestures of negation that are being performed. Okay, so I'd like you to focus on the hand and arm movements that are being shown in this gesture of negation. It might be with sound, it might be without sound, I don't know.
I don't like getting my nose punched. It's been broken already, it doesn't need to.
Okay, so remember we're focusing on the gestures that the speaker is making. See if you can identify various hand movements or hand shapes that seem to be linked to the act of negation. So I'll show the clip again.
I don't like getting my nose punched. It's been broken already, it doesn't need to.
Okay, that might seem like a disorganized stream of gesture to the untrained eye, but when we start looking at these gestures closely, we can identify specific forms and specific structures within the gestural stream, so I'll be showing you how to do that in just a while. But first of all, I'd like to give the outline of the presentation. I will be focusing on gestures of negation in English. I'll begin with a methodology, so I'll explain exactly how we collect negative utterances and how we analyze them. Then I'll present my findings, that are the main gestures that English speakers perform when they negate. I'll talk about how speakers organize these gestures in relation to speech, so I'll focus on one specific gesture of negation and show how speakers use it when negating. And then we'll step back from the specific instances and have a look at the status of gesture in relation to language. Okay, so my methodology will be very brief and quite simplified. Basically, I filmed English speakers having conversations and garnered 8 hours and 23 minutes of conversations among over 30 English-speaking subjects. I imported the clips into ELAN annotation software, which you can download free from the Max Planck Institute website. And this allows you to look at video and listen to the speech at the same time, and you have tiers of analysis that you can fill in with your various the various parameters that you wish to analyze. So what I did was looked for instances where speakers used a vocal negation, and I selected those and created a subfolder which allowed me to look at negative utterances, and then I went on and transcribed speech and gesture. Now, transcribing speech, I remained relatively simple, and I just used the Appendix 1 of Adam Kendon's 2004 book, Gesture. Basically, you transcribe speech with conventional orthography. You indicate pauses in speech with little dots, and then you indicate intonation units or tonic syllables with capital letters. However, for gesture, which was the focus of my PhD, I spent a lot more time transcribing the data, and I used new methods of gesture analysis that have been developed quite recently, especially by the Berlin Gesture School, notably by scholars such as Cornelia Muller, Jana Bressem, Silva Ladovig, Ellen Fricker, and Irene Mittelberg. Now, these methods involve looking at the video clips in silence and just focusing on the gestural form, okay? So we have the clips and we watch them in silence so that we are not influenced by what the speaker is saying. If we hear what's being said, we might tend to input meaning to the gestures, whereas without sound, we can just describe the formal properties. And there are two highly important properties that we have to note when looking at gesture. One of these is gesture form. Okay, so every gesture has a hand shape, could be a fist, flat hand, single fingers, combination of fingers. I must add that this is from Jana Bressem's work that is in prep. Every gesture has a palm orientation, palm up, palm down, palm lateral, palm vertical. There is a location in gesture space, and this is McNeil's figure taken from his 1992 work, which is very useful for showing the different areas in space where speakers perform their gestures. And finally, every gesture has a movement parameter. So those are the 4 parameters of gestural action that we need to take into account. Now, the other important feature of a gesture that needs to be considered is the linear structure. Okay, so gestures are excursions, as Adam Kendon would say. The hands begin at rest, okay? So we can note an onset of gestural action. So there are boundaries to gestural action. After the onset, we have a preparation phase where the hands move into the space in front of the speaker, preparing the gesture. The stroke phase is the moment of gestural action where the movement dynamics, the hand shapes, the locations, everything becomes at its most clearest and most dynamic. Okay, and it's said to be the moment when the meaning of the gesture is achieved. Sometimes the gesture is held in space after the stroke, and we call this a post-stroke hold. And finally, the hands return to their position of rest, and we call that phase the recovery. Okay, so just to give you an example of a gesture, a speaker might be sat still with their hands at rest, and then they go to make a gesture, so the hands begin preparing the gesture and move into the gesture space. They perform the gesture, so that would be the gesture stroke, and sometimes they can be held, that's the post-stroke hold, and then the hands can move back to their position of rest, and that's a recovery phase, and then the action stops, and that is considered to be a full gesture phrase. Okay, so when analysing negative speech acts, we don't need to analyse all the gestures if we're focusing on gestures of negation, because not all gestures refer to the negative speech act. So if a speaker says, I don't like getting my nose punched, and makes a gesture touching the nose, it means that the gesture has added referential content to the utterance. Okay? The gesture is linked to nose, which is part of the propositional content of the utterance. But if the same speaker says, I don't like getting my nose punched, okay, there's something intuitively that tells us that this gesture is linked to the act of negation. Okay? So when we say which gestures, we can distinguish between 2 types. There are 2 broad categories, as defined by Cornelia Muller in 1998, referential and performative gestures. So referential gestures are the ones that add to propositional content of the utterance, such as I don't like getting my nose punched and the speaker touching their nose, but performative gestures in negative speech acts are linked to the act of negation itself, and these gestures have different characteristics, okay? Performative gestures of negation exhibit standard, recognizable forms. Okay, so as we saw in the picture, they are mostly palm down or palm vertical gestures. Okay, so gestures where the hands are facing the ground and they're moved side to side, or where the palms are facing away from the speaker, and they can also be moved side to side. But head shakes also play an important role in negation. Now, there has been some previous work on these gestures of negation. Geneviève Calbris and Adam Kendon have observed gestures of negation among French and Italian speakers, but so far nobody has analysed these in any depth among English speakers, and also Calbris and Kendon's work focused on aspects other than form and structure. So Geneviève Calbris focused on the semiotic structures and semantics of these gestures, whereas Adam Kendon tended to focus on the context of use and how the negative meaning in the gesture combines with the vocal components to create the negative utterance. So my focus is on the forms that speakers can produce and how they organize them, how they deploy them in space in relation to their speech. Okay, so in my data set, I identified 3 palm down gestures and 6 palm vertical gestures that the subjects perform consistently in various contexts of negation. Okay, I must add that these are just the most common gestures that I observed. There are other gestures, okay, of negation that I didn't have enough data to analyze in full detail. So there are also gestures that are not made with palm downs or palm verticals, such as the index finger raise in warning or shaken from side to side. I didn't consider these gestures, so I was only considering the palm down and palm vertical gestures. as well as the head shake. So I'm about to show a slide, and on this slide you will see the 9 gestures that I identified, and these are drawings taken from frame grabs of the negative utterances. Okay, above the red dashed line we have the 3 palm down gestures. Gesture 1 is the palm down across body horizontal gesture. Okay, gesture 2 is the 2 palms down across body horizontal with diagonal movement gesture. And gesture 3 is the 2 palms down from mid body with horizontal movement. Now the difference of gesture 3 and gesture 2 and 1 is that the hands begin their horizontal movement from the mid line of the speaker's body. Okay, whereas the gestures 1 and 2, the speakers bring their hands across their bodies so that they're actually on the other sides, the opposite sides of their bodies when they start the movement. Okay, below the red dashed line we have the 6 palm vertical gestures. Gesture 4 is the palm vertical raise. Gesture 5 is the palm vertical oscillate gesture. Gesture 6 is the palm vertical with horizontal movement gesture. Gesture 7 is a 2 palms vertical raise. Gesture 8 is 2 palms vertical oscillate. And gesture 9 is the 2 palms vertical horizontal gesture with horizontal movement. Okay. Now, in my thesis, I go into a lot of detail about each one of these gesture forms, describing its relation to negation, how speakers deploy it in space as they're performing their negative speech act, how the gestural elements and the different phases of gestural action relate to the vocal negation. And I don't have time to go into much detail here now, but what I will do is focus on one particular gesture, which is the palm down across body gesture, and I will ask the question, I will explain how speakers organize the palm down across body gesture in relation to their speech. Okay, so focusing now on this gesture, let me say that it is the most frequent negation gesture. So in my corpus, speakers perform this gesture more often than any other of the gestures. Okay. And they perform it in 2 main contexts. In context 1, the speaker is negating an action or a situation. So a simple example would be the utterance we saw at the beginning, I don't have to pay. Okay? This gesture occurs in that context, but it also occurs in a second context when speakers are stating dislikes. So an example would be a speaker saying, household chores, oh no, I don't like ironing or vacuuming. Okay, so that the gesture also occurs in the second context. Let's focus on the first context, and I will show you how speakers organize the gesture in relation to their speech. Here's an example utterance with the gesture transcribed. Speaker says, I don't have to pay. Okay? Now, if you look at the transcription, you see that the speaker prepares the gesture of negation in advance of the negative node, synchronizes the stroke of the gesture with the negative node, and then holds the gesture in space, that is, performs a post-stroke hold throughout scope of negation. Okay, so in context 1, stroke and hold of gesture correspond to node and scope of negation. And this is quite an interesting finding, because scope of negation is a theoretical construct, okay? It's not visible in speech. The only way you can see scope in speech is by doing syntactic tests and showing that certain elements can lie within scope but others not. Okay? Gesture, however, is highly visible, and a flat hand held in space must draw attention from both the speaker and the interlocutor. So I hypothesize in the thesis that post-stroke holds in this context, in these types of utterances, can be used by the speakers and the interlocutors to help parse the different elements of a negative utterance. So to show, perhaps, which elements the negation applies to, how far the scope of negation extends throughout the utterance. Okay, let's look at it now in some examples. So here are 2 examples. In the first one, the speaker says, I was no-go territory. Okay, again, he brings his hand across the body before the negative node, synchronizes the stroke with the negative node, and then holds the gesture in space throughout scope.
boyfriend, so I was like no-go territory.
Yeah. Okay, we'll watch that again.
Boyfriend, so I was like no-go territory.
Yeah. Okay, just a footnote that I think is quite interesting. Not only might the post-stroke hold serve to indicate different aspects of the scope of negation, but I get the feeling that if the speaker brings his hand across body so early on before the negation, it's perhaps to prepare the stroke so that it synchronizes with the negative node, but perhaps also to indicate that a negation is imminent. So perhaps the gesture preparation phase might have a function as well, which is to, in these gestures of negation, to indicate that a negation in speech is imminent. Okay, let's have a look at the second example. The speaker says, if I don't stay here, I don't have to pay. Okay, and we're interested in the second gesture that he performs.
If I don't stay here, I don't have to pay.
And we'll watch that again.
If I don't stay here, I don't have to pay.
So again, he synchronizes the stroke of the gesture with the negative node, and he holds the gesture in scope throughout the utterance. So again, just another interesting point is that in the first example, the speaker said no-go territory. Okay, so that is within a noun phrase. And in the second utterance, the speaker said don't have to pay. Okay, so that's a verb phrase. Now we can see that this stroke, hold, and node scope distinction applies at different levels of discourse structure. So that in itself is a pretty interesting finding. Okay, in the second context of the palm down across body gesture, speakers state their dislikes and they perform the gesture. Okay, so the best way to do this is to have an example. The speaker has been asked what kind of TV soaps he likes, and he says, gossipy, light-hearted soaps. None of these heavy, where everybody dies, and they're probably fighting, and they hate each other for most of it. Okay, so the context is different, and this context requires a different type of negation. Okay, here we have a non-verbal negator, none of. So it's non-verbal because it negates elements other than verbs. So here it negates attributes of light-hearted soaps, attributes of the soaps the speaker doesn't like. So they are heavy soaps, so it projects scope of negation onto these elements. The ones where everybody dies, and the ones where they're probably fighting, okay? So they're the specific elements that the none-of negates. Now, interestingly enough, when the speaker performs the gestures, he also performs... Okay, so he organizes his gestures in a slightly different way to the first context. In this context, the negative node triggers gesture preparation, okay, so that the stroke can synchronize with the specific elements in scope. So his strokes synchronize with heavy, with dies, and with fighting. Okay? Now remember that focus is a basic negative construct. Now here we see that focus is also part of gesture, and that gesture might be helping to focus the scope projected from the negative node onto specific elements in the speaker's utterance, further down the syntax. Let's have a look at the video clip.
Like gossipy, light-hearted soaps. None of these heavy, where everybody dies and they're probably fighting and hate each other for most of it.
Okay, so let's see that again.
Like gossipy, light-hearted soaps. None of these heavy, where everybody dies and they're probably fighting and hate each other for most of it.
Okay, how can we account for the fact that speakers, when they negate, they use these gestures of negation, but they also use grammatical particles of negation, and they structure their utterances very specifically using both? Okay, so one way to describe them is to say that we have multimodal negative utterances. Okay, so negation is in both modes, in the spoken mode and in a gestural mode, and the two are working together. Now, here are some characteristics of multimodal negative utterances. Speakers can synchronize vocal and gestural negations, as we saw, the palm down across body gesture can be synchronized with the negative node. Okay? But we also saw how these gestures can be sequenced with vocal forms. So in the previous example, when the speaker said, none of those heavy where everybody dies and they're fighting and probably hate each other, okay, the vocal negation came first, okay, and then later down the syntax, we had the gestures of negation. So it's as if negation flows through and across modalities as the speaker is constructing his or her discourse. Okay, now something that's quite fascinating is that speakers can actually sequence gestural forms of negation in a multimodal negative utterance too. Okay, so let's dwell on this for just a second, and I'll show you a clip now where a speaker produces a whole sequence of gestures, and you'll see that in the sequence there are some gestures of negation as well. So it's almost as if the speaker is creating an entire utterance in the gestural mode, but at the same time he's speaking. So these two modes must be working together, but let's just focus on the sequence of gestures. Okay, so we just saw a sequence of gestures without sound, and what I'd like to do is use this as a point of departure now to draw some conclusions about the general design of speech and gesture and its relation to language. So we can say that speakers have repertoires of vocal and gestural forms to negate. Okay, both are highly conventional and both are organized in systematic ways. Okay, speakers use both modalities to create multimodal negative utterances. Okay, this isn't a rare phenomena. This is what happens pretty much whenever somebody negates in speech. Okay, and both are an equal part of language, as Adam Kendon, I'm sure, would argue, and as many studies up to today would argue. And what I've shown is that there is evidence for negative constructs such as node and scope and focus in gesture. And gesture actually sheds new light on negation. So the fact that maybe we could use post-stroke holds to help us understand scope of negation a bit better is quite an interesting prospect. To conclude, I'd like to say that there's a clear link in these negative utterances between grammar and gesture. And this is something that is not really discussed today in modern linguistics. People see grammar as like the highly conventionalized aspect of speech, and gesture, if they do consider it, is the sort of fleeting hand and arm movements that accompany speech or that are sort of helpers to speech. But here we see them both working together. Okay, conventional aspects of speech in the form of negative particles, conventional aspects of gesture in the form of these recurrent conventional gestures of negation working together. And I think we could come back to Wendy's introduction about the previous research on language and social interaction and gesture studies to ask what would happen if we really develop these new methods of gesture analysis, which are much simpler than the ones developed by Birdwhistle and friends. We could perhaps reconsider proxemics. So look exactly how the speakers are using the space, okay? Because we seem to have just excluded proxemics, chronemics, and kinesics, just so we can focus on manual gestures and, of course, head shakes and head nods. But I think now would be a good point to broaden the scope of gestural analysis and reconsider these aspects, and perhaps we would come to see that language is definitely a much broader concept than we thought, even as gesture researchers, and proxemics, chronemics, and kinesics are surely a part and parcel of speaking. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, feel free to contact Wendy or myself. There are email addresses there, wendy.leeds.hurwitz@gmail.com, and you can contact me on simon.harrison@ENS-Lyon.fr. And for references, see the link on the website. So thank you again for your attention.